On January 3rd of 2026, the United States military captured Nicolás Maduro in his own presidential compound. 32 Cuban soldiers died defending him. Cuba has denied for years that it had troops in Venezuela. Now 32 of them came home in body bags. And that wasn't even the worst part. Because when Maduro fell, he didn't just take Venezuela's government with him. He took Cuba's last lifeline. The oil stopped, the money froze, and an island that had been quietly dying for years just lost the only thing keeping the lights on. This isn't a crisis. This is the final act. Cuba didn't collapse because of one event. It collapsed because for 500 years, it never learned to stand on its own. And now, there's no one left to catch it. To understand why Cuba is unraveling right now, you need to understand something that most people completely miss. Cuba has never, not once in its entire 500-year modern history, survived without a foreign patron covering the bill. Think about that. Half a millennium. Not a single decade of genuine self-sufficiency. Every era of Cuban prosperity was actually someone else's prosperity, running through Cuba on the way to somewhere else. When Spain controlled the island for nearly 400 years, Cuba existed as a sugar colony built on slave labor, shipping every ounce of wealth back to Madrid. The island wasn't developed for Cubans. It was developed for extraction. For the first 3 centuries, Spain barely even bothered with agriculture. Cuba was just a pit stop, a naval waypoint for the treasure fleet sailing between the Americas and Europe. It wasn't until Haiti's sugar production collapsed due to slave revolts in the late 1700s that Cuba became the world's sugar factory. And in the early 1800s, Cuba was the wealthiest colony on Earth. But all that wealth just stood on 3 legs: one crop, slave labor, and foreign markets. Kick out any one of them, and the whole thing falls over. When the Americans stepped in after the Spanish-American War in 1898, they didn't liberate Cuba, they leashed it. The Platt Amendment gave Washington the legal right to intervene militarily whenever it wanted and barred Cuba from signing independent international treaties. By the 1920s, American companies controlled 55% of the sugar industry and roughly 90% of the island's electricity and telecommunications infrastructure. Cuba looked prosperous on paper, 5th highest per capita income in Latin America, but every dollar of that prosperity flowed through American boardrooms. You pull that plug and Cuba, they had nothing. Then came the revolution. Fidel Castro threw out the Americans in 1959 and immediately replaced them with the Soviets. Moscow became the new sponsor, buying Cuban sugar at 3 to 6 times the world market price. In 1987, the Soviets paid 42 cents per pound for sugar that traded globally at just 7 cents. They pumped an average of $4.3 billion into the island, which amounted to over 21% of Cuba's entire national output. They even let Cuba resell excess Soviet oil on the open market for hard currency, a scheme that generated more revenue than the sugar itself. Cuba didn't need to diversify. It didn't need to build a real economy. It just needed to keep cashing those checks. And then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Cuba nearly went with it. What followed was a nightmare that the regime called the special period in a time of peace. GDP crashed by 35%. The island lost 85% of its export markets overnight and 70% of total imports. The resulting shortages were apocalyptic. Daily bread rations dropped to 80 grams per person. Over 300 medicines vanished from pharmacies. The average Cuban lost 12 pounds of body weight. More than 50,000 people went partially blind from a vitamin B epidemic caused by mass malnutrition. Blackouts lasted up to 20 hours a day. Half of Havana's bus fleet sat immobile. The government handed out 700,000 Chinese bicycles in 1993. Farmers went back to plowing fields with ox. Now, the regime survived, barely, by betraying its own principles. It legalized the US dollar. It allowed private property. It opened the country to foreign tourism and remittances. But these measures, they didn't fix anything. They just bought time. And then came the rescue from Venezuela. But Venezuela didn't just save Cuba, it created the most dangerous addiction of all. Because this time, when the lifeline broke, there was nobody waiting on the other side. In the early 2000s, Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro forged what looked like socialist solidarity, but functioned as a life support machine. Under the deal, Venezuela shipped roughly 100,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba at massively subsidized rates. Only 60% paid up front. The rest financed over 25 years at 1% interest. In return, Cuba exported over 30,000 doctors, teachers, and military advisors to Venezuela. By 2012, this single relationship accounted for nearly 40% of Cuba's entire GDP. That's not a trade partnership. That's an IV drip. And when Venezuela's own economy began to implode under Maduro, collapsing oil production, hyperinflation, sanctions, the drip, well, it started running dry. Oil shipments fell from 100,000 barrels a day at peak to about 55,000 by 2023, and then to about 30,000 as U.S. enforcement tightened the chokehold on sanctioned tankered shipments. And then came January 3rd of 2026, and everything changed. In the dead of night, U.S. forces launched what the Pentagon called Operation Absolute Resolve, a surgical strike on Maduro's compound in Caracas. Maduro and his wife were extracted under fire, loaded onto the USS Iwo Jima, and transported to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. Trump posted a photo of Maduro aboard the warship on Truth Social within hours. And despite the raid, 32 Cuban military operatives, members of an elite unit called the Avispas Negras, the Black Wasps, were killed defending the Venezuelan president. These weren't advisors or consultants. They were embedded bodyguards, a parallel security force that had taken over protection of Venezuela's head of state. For years, Havana had categorically denied ever having any military presence in Venezuela. But now, with 32 dead soldiers, it was forced to publicly acknowledge what everyone had long suspected. Cuba had been running a shadow security operation inside a sovereign nation. For the Cuban military, this was a humiliation on a scale not seen since the Bay of Pigs. The destruction of the Black Wasps, a unit that represented the regime's elite projection of power, sent a psychological shockwave through Havana's military command. Defense exercises were immediately ordered across the island. Surveillance ramped up. Díaz-Canel publicly condemned the U.S. action and vowed that Cuba would give even its own blood, even its own lives. The regime shifted into full wartime posture. But the strategic damage was far worse than the symbolic blow. President Trump immediately declared what his administration branded the Monroe Doctrine, an updated Monroe Doctrine treating the entire Western Hemisphere as an exclusive American sphere of influence. He announced a total blockade on all oil and money reaching Cuba, stating plainly, there will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. According to satellite tracking services, no oil tankers have left Venezuela for Cuba since. Cuba was also redesignated as a state sponsor of terrorism, effectively freezing the military establishment out of the global financial system and slamming shut the last doors to any international credit. And here's where things go from bad to catastrophic, because cutting off Venezuela's oil, it didn't just damage Cuba's economy, it flatlined the power grid. Cuba's entire electrical system runs on 8 major oil-fired thermal plants, most built in the 1980s with Soviet-era technology. They were never designed to still be operating in 2025. They burn heavy, sulfur-rich domestic crude that chews through aging turbines and boilers at a punishing rate. And they've been starving for fuel for years. Between October of 2024 and September of 2025, the grid suffered 5 total nationwide collapses. We're not talking brownouts, not rolling blackouts, complete nationwide darkness. Every light, every pump, every hospital machine, all going dead at once. The Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant in Matanzas, Cuba's largest generating facility, it's become the symbol of this death spiral. When Guterres goes down, the whole country goes dark. On October 18th of 2024, the plant's sudden failure plunged the entire island into a blackout for 5 consecutive days. The worst power outage in Cuban history. In November, Hurricane Rafael caused another cascade of grid failures. December brought another Guterres trip. In March 2025, a substation breakdown in Diez Mero killed the grid for 2 more days. In September, a single false boiler signal alarm at Guterres triggered yet another national collapse. By mid-2025, Cuba could only meet 50 to 70% of its daily electricity demand on a good day. Generation deficits regularly exceeded 1,500 megawatts, nearly half the entire national load just simply missing. 3 of the country's 7 major stations were fully offline by October, with the remaining plants running at just 25% capacity. The government's desperation play was leasing floating power barges, Turkish-built car power ships anchored offshore. But those require hard currency payments that the state can no longer make. putting them at constant risk of being pulled away. Outside Havana, the reality is medieval. 18 to 22 hours without electricity every single day. Water pumps sit dead, meaning no running water for days at a time. Food spoils within hours in the tropical heat. Hospitals run on emergency generators that break down from overuse faster than they can be repaired. And even when they work, there's no medicine to administer. Traffic lights are dark across entire cities. Police officers try to direct traffic by hand while accidents spike. Protesters in multiple provinces have taken to banging pots and pans in the street, chanting, "We want light," and have been met with riot police. Nearly 1 million people, roughly 10% of the remaining population, face daily water supply disruptions because the pumping stations depend on electricity that just no longer exists. A former Cuban central bank economist, Pablo Vidal, warned that if oil supplies cease entirely, the Cuban economy would grind to a halt. A butcher in Havana named Ray Rodriguez put it very simply: less oil, more blackouts. Young people are going to become even more pessimistic. A 29-year-old teacher in Cienfuegos told reporters, "We've learned to live by the sun. When it sets, the country shuts down." But here's what most people don't realize. The regime's most devastating blow, it didn't come from Washington or Caracas. It came from Havana itself. In January 2021, the government launched Tarea Ordenamiento, the ordering task, a sweeping monetary reform designed to eliminate the dual currency system that had operated since the special period. The state devalued the Cuban peso from a 1-to-1 parity with the dollar to 24-to-1 overnight. To soften the impact, it tripled state salaries and pensions on paper in late 2020. On paper, it looked like modernization, but in reality, it was detonation. The massive cash injection, without any corresponding increase in production or available goods, triggered an inflationary death spiral. Prices skyrocketed. Store shelves stayed empty. By late 2021, the black market exchange rate had exploded past 300 pesos for $1, rendering those tripled salaries worth less than what workers earned before the reform. Independent economists estimate that the reform made Cubans effectively 700 times poorer. Let that sink in. Not 7 times, not 70, 700. Today, the minimum wage covers roughly 5% of the cost of a basic monthly food basket. A carton of 30 eggs costs an entire month's salary for many. A single tank of cooking gas exceeds what most workers earn in a month. And by October of 2025, the minimum pension sat at 4,000 pesos, less than $10 a month, about 30 cents a day. The World Bank extreme poverty line is $32.15. The regime's refusal to liberalize productive forces to allow a genuine private sector to emerge meant that there was no supply-side response to absorb the inflation. The state maintained its stranglehold on the economy through its monopolies, ensuring that hunger became the norm, not the exception. And none of this was caused by the embargo. This was entirely self-inflicted. So where did the money actually go? Because here's the part that should make your blood boil. If you're finding this kind of deep dive very valuable, please take a second to subscribe to Fall of Nations. We cover the collapse stories that mainstream media just glosses over, and your support is what keeps this channel going. Now, back to the money, because this is the bombshell. While ordinary Cubans skip meals, 7 out of 10 now go regularly without breakfast, lunch, or dinner. A leaked trove of 22 secret internal finance documents from 2024 revealed something explosive. Cuba's military conglomerate, GAISA, is sitting on a mountain of cash. GAISA, Grupo de Administración Empresarial S.A., is the business empire of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, built in the 1990s originally to circumvent the U.S. embargo. Today, it controls roughly 40% of Cuba's entire economy. Tourism through the Gaviota hotel chain, retail through Cimex and TRD Saribe, banking through Banco Financiero Internacional, remittance processing, foreign trade, logistics, even the port of Meriel, all of it funneled through a network of subsidiaries that answer to no civilian authority. They pay virtually no taxes and operate completely outside the jurisdiction of Cuba's central bank, its Office of the Comptroller General, or any government auditor. The leaked balance sheets show GAISA held $18 billion in current assets as of March 2024, with $14.5 billion sitting in its own bank accounts. In just the first 3 months of that year, the conglomerate generated $2.1 billion in net profit. Its tourism subsidiary, Gaviota, poured billions into building luxury resort hotels all across the island. Hotels that sit almost entirely empty. 70% of rooms were vacant through the first half of 2023. Between March and August of 2024 alone, Gaviota's balance sheets dropped from $8.5 billion to $2.7 billion. Over $5 billion vanished in 5 months, with no public explanation of where that money went. And while those billions disappeared into military accounts, the government told its own citizens that it couldn't afford $250 million a year to maintain the electrical grid, or the $129 million needed to stock hospitals with basic medication. 70% of essential medicines are unavailable. Cubans are digging through garbage for food, and Gaisa builds empty luxury hotels. When Comptroller General Gladys Bejarano attempted to audit Gaisa, she was informed the military conglomerate fell outside her jurisdiction. She was dismissed shortly after, no explanation given. The only body with oversight of Gaisa's finances is something called Department V of the Armed Forces, a shadowy internal unit with zero public accountability. Nobody outside the military's inner circle knows where that money goes. The state that tells its people that there's no money for medicine holds more cash reserves than the governments of Panama, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. As Cuban economist Pavel Vidal told reporters, look, for a long time, there have been two parallel governments, one that starves and one that feasts. And this is what makes the whole thing irreversible. Because Cuba, it's not losing its economy, it's losing its people, permanently. Since 2021, over 1.2 million Cubans have fled the island. The official population has plummeted from 11.1 million to 7.9 million in just 4 years, a decline of more than 12%. Some independent demographers believe the real loss is significantly higher. At a December 2025 session of the National Assembly, government projections warned that Cuba's population could fall to just 7.7 million by 2050, roughly where it stood a century earlier. But it's not just the scale, it's who's leaving. The doctors, engineers, teachers, the young, the skilled, the people that have any functioning society needs to keep running. Hospitals now operate with skeleton crews, when they operate at all. Schools in rural provinces are shuttering because they have no teachers left. Entire neighborhoods are hollowing out, leaving behind the elderly and the destitute, the people least capable of rebuilding anything. Cuban demographers have compared the scale of this population loss to what is typically only seen in countries at war. And unlike a war, there's no ceasefire coming. U.S. Customs and Border Protection have recorded over 200,000 Cuban migrant encounters in fiscal year 2023, and more than 217,000 in 2024. Under Trump's new immigration policies, those pathways are now being shut down. But that hasn't stopped people from trying. The desperation to leave has reached a level where the journey itself, however dangerous, is considered less risky than staying. A 2025 study by the Cuban Observatory of Human Rights found that 89% of the remaining population now lives in extreme poverty. 7 out of 10 Cubans regularly skip meals. Among those over 61, that figure rises to 8 out of 10. And 78% of respondents either wanted to emigrate or know someone who does. When asked where they go, 30% said the US, but 34%, the single largest group, said anywhere. Anywhere at all, just to escape. China and Russia, 2% combined. Nobody wants to trade one collapsing system for another. Now, even Cuba's security apparatus is cracking under the strain. Reports indicate that officers of the Ministry of the Interior face caloric deficits and lack fuel to maintain routine patrols. The repressive machine built to keep the population in check is running on fumes, just like everything else on the island. In July of 2021, when thousands took to the streets in the largest protest since the revolution, the regime crushed them with mass arrests and internet shutdowns. But that was before the grid collapsed, before the oil stopped, before a quarter of the population left. The question isn't whether people are angry enough to protest again. The question is whether the regime still has the resources to stop them. So, where does this end? There's no Soviet Union coming back. Venezuela is under U.S. military supervision. Its oil revenues are redirected. China has shown zero interest in bankrolling a Caribbean client state with a track record of defaulting on every debt it's ever taken. And under the Don Roe doctrine, Beijing faces direct confrontation with Washington if it tries. Mexico, Cuba's second largest oil supplier, is under intense pressure from the Trump administration not to step into Venezuela's role. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has launched a strategy of maximum pressure, explicitly designed to push the regime toward institutional collapse. Cuba has no allies willing to carry the cost, no economy capable of generating its own revenue, no workforce left to rebuild with, and no political leadership willing to reform. Not when the generals controlling Gaisa have billions in offshore accounts and absolutely nothing to gain from opening the system. Vietnam reformed. China, it reformed. Cuba's own allies have begged it to reform, and the regime's answer has been the same for 65 years. And the math is now impossible. The economy has been in recession for 6 consecutive years. Tourism, once a lifeline, has cratered. Inflation was running at an annualized rate of 30% at the start of 2025 and climbing. The government's own newly proposed economic stabilization plan, it doesn't even mention Gaisa, meaning that the burden of any adjustment will fall entirely on the civilian population, the small private businesses, and the state workers that are already earning less than $1 a day. President Trump told the world that Cuba is ready to fall. Senator Lindsey Graham echoed him. Secretary Rubio made it clear that nothing less than root and branch political reform will satisfy Washington. And the regime has no interest in offering that. Diaz-Canel responded by promising to fight, quote, to the last drop of blood. But blood, it doesn't power generators, it doesn't fill pharmacies, and it doesn't bring back the million-plus citizens who've already voted with their feet. Cuba wasn't built to survive on its own. It was built to be rescued. And for the first time in 500 years, nobody's coming. So what do you think? Is this finally the end of the Castro system, or will the regime find yet another way to cling to power? And if it does collapse, what happens to the nearly 10 million people still trapped on an island with no power, no food, and no way out? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of the collapse stories that the mainstream media just won't touch, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We break down the fall so you can see it coming.